Okay, so it's my great honor tonight to introduce Dr. Amanda Vincent to you. Dr. Vincent holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge, England, and an Honours Bachelor of Science from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. She was a visiting fellow in Sweden and Germany, and a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford, England. She was on faculty at McGill University, Montreal, where she was named a William Dawson Scholar in 2000. And the same year, Dr. Vincent was named a Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation, the world's preeminent award in that field. She moved to UBC in 2002 with a Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Marine Conservation. Dr. Vincent was the first person to study seahorses underwater, the first to document the extensive trade in these fishes, and the first to initiate a seahorse conservation project. Her team's research and advocacy work for marine conservation have earned Dr. Vincent multiple awards and accolades. In 1996, Dr. Vincent co-founded and still directs Project Seahorse, an interdisciplinary and international organization committed to conservation and sustainable use of the world's coastal marine ecosystems. Dr. Vincent is very active in marine management and policy issues. She is chair of the IUCN SSC, Seahorse, Pipefish, and Sea Dragon Group. She has written hundreds of scientific papers, technical reports, popular articles, and policy briefings. So we are so pleased to have her here tonight to talk about all of this with you. Questions, we're going to ask you to save them till the end. Put your questions in the chat, and we will get to those at the end of the talk. So, turning it over to you, Dr. Vince.
Thank you so much. Yeah, look at it. I think I need them right now. Just a sec. All right. It's really lovely to be here and to have some of us in person gathering. This is really exciting. And I'm really thrilled that so many people have joined on Zoom as well, which is more familiar these days than in person. I want to add my own recognition of the fact that we're on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And particularly on this eve of our National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, where we, I think, all are going to spend time tomorrow trying to find ways to overcome some of the awful behaviors of the past and build a better future. So it's really important that we continue to reflect on our relationship with Indigenous people. I also want to really thank Nature Vancouver for inviting me. I'm not sure how many of you know, but I once had a very happy week up in Manning Park with Nature Vancouver because my daughter, who was then probably about 6 years old maybe, won a scholarship that was being offered by Nature Vancouver for a family to come up and spend the week at a summer camp. So my daughter, who was about 6, and my son, who was about 3, and I had this brilliant time exploring and dining in the big tent and being exposed to some of the best naturalists in the province. It was really quite splendid. So many thanks again for that really special experience that we still talk about. So I'm going to now take you into my talk. So just 1 minute. All right, we'll see what happens. All right, so we worry a lot about climate change and how it affects our ocean, and we talk a lot about plastics and their impacts on marine life. But in fact, the really big problem, the tremendous pressure that is causing the greatest grief comes from poorly managed fisheries. And we need to keep track of that. Whenever you hear people talking about plastics or climate change, please remind them the single biggest pressure by far on our ocean is poorly managed fisheries. So let me explain. I'm going to particularly focus on bottom trawling, which is a hugely dominant fishing practice that involves towing and stripping and bulldozing and clear cutting the ocean floor. It has huge and devastating impacts. Now, I want to be clear that I have no desire to end fishing, but I have a really big desire to end bottom trawling and other non-selective destructive fishing practices. And I don't want to stop it abruptly. That's never going to work. What we need to do is have a phased transition whereby we pay attention to the socioeconomic issues, but we recognize the incredible destruction on all counts from bottom trawling. So it's a really complex issue, and I was trying to think how best to explain it. And I decided that I'd take you on a voyage, my voyage really, of coming to understand and be concerned about bottom trawling. So I'm going to talk to you about what I learned about bottom trawling, the research that we're tackling to resolve it, and how to figure out ways forward. But the end point in my trajectory will be to try to end bottom trawling in a systematic way that's respectful and thoughtful. So my voyage, which is what we're all going to take tonight, actually began with seahorses. And I fell in love with these extraordinary animals for their male pregnancy, their tremendous camouflage abilities, their crazy anatomy, and much more. And it turns out seahorses, we've learned over decades now, are fantastic ambassadors for all other marine species. Every single time I start talking about seahorses in any context, people stop to listen. They really want to understand about seahorses. So we've learned that if we work to save seahorses, we're actually doing a lot of good for the oceans in general. So saving seahorses leads us actually to save the seas. And in saving the seas, we're going to support the seahorses. This is all stuff that, knowledge that's been accrued over decades. But when I started out, I just wanted to watch seahorses. So I spent a lot of time working away idyllically on seahorse behavior and ecology. And here's me in the good old days studying little tiny, these seahorses are the size of your baby fingernail, the pygmy seahorses, studying them at depth. And then I would work a lot in seagrasses, where a huge number of the species live. They also live in mangroves and coral reefs, mangroves and estuaries, and in soft bottom habitats in general, macroalgae, so kelp as well. And this was a very wonderful existence, trying to understand the evolution of sex differences, looking at pair bonding, looking at male pregnancy, until one rather extraordinary day in Germany. So I was in Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, way back when, and there was a scrolling electronic billboard. And it said, and I will translate literally, you can fill the gap, that seahorses are the most valuable exports from the Philippines to help men with weak tails. So I was mesmerized by this and wanted to know an awful lot more. So at that point, I was writing an article for National Geographic, and I asked if I could please go and explore this idea in the Philippines, and they agreed as long as I could guarantee them a few paragraphs. Well, decades later, we've more than met that remit. So that voyage, that National Geographic funded thing, allowed us to go and investigate fisheries in the Philippines. And what we found through constant discussions and interviews and exchanges with taxi drivers and ferry boat captains and fishers, of course, and government officials was that the small-scale fisheries were taking a lot of seahorses, a lot. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So we focused on the small-scale fisheries for rather a long time, for quite a few years. And mostly what we were focused on was setting up marine protected areas. So fishing exclusion zones, no fishing zones, no take zones. And we were extremely successful at that. We were able to, through community-based initiatives, set up 35 no-take zones that mostly still persist to this day, decades later. So it was extremely exciting. I want to be clear, when I say we, I was very much a backseat driver, and the really frontline work was undertaken by Filipino biologists paired with Filipino social workers, community organizers. And that pairing of the technical with the social, the people, if you will, experts, was what made it really effective. And I often feel that DFO needs to get a grip, and Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, and realize that we're not managing the fish, we're managing the fishers and the fisheries, and it's social acumen that's actually going to take us much farther often than technical knowledge. So during all this, we got very deeply involved in these small-scale targeted fisheries, and we really paid very little attention to other fisheries that were taking seahorses. But it didn't seem like much of a big deal. So this, for example, is the bycatch of a trawl net. You'll notice it's awfully hard to decide what they were out to catch, and this has become a hallmark of fishing by trawl gear. You really don't know what they were out for. And in this case, seahorses were only being caught, wherever we did the research, 1 or 2 seahorses per vessel per night. So let's just pause on that. 1 or 2 seahorses per vessel per night. Doesn't seem worth getting worked up about, does it really? I'm going to come back to that, because it turns out that's very worth getting concerned about. At the same time that we were doing this fisheries survey work, hobnobbing with fishers all over the world, really, in tens of countries, scores of countries actually. We were also doing trade research in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is the biggest single entrepot for wildlife trade, although that's changing a little bit, but it was hugely significant for wildlife trade, particularly for traditional medicine. And we had a long collaboration there. We still actually collaborate with the Hong Kong traditional Chinese medicine dealers, who are the primary users of seahorses around the world. We have a long-standing belief that, well, conviction, confidence, that shouting at people does no good whatsoever. So it's always been a dialogue and exchange to try to figure out how best we could find common ground. And in Hong Kong, we were able easily to find common ground with the traditional Chinese Medicine Merchants Association, because they too wanted seahorses around for millennia. That was the scale of their understanding of their medicinal practices. So they were very receptive to working with us to try to understand what was going on. And in collaborating with them, we came up with a number of changes that were going to be useful and reveal just how global the seahorse sourcing might be. And from that work, it became really clear through years that there was tremendous decline in seahorse populations around the world, that we were really seeing the collapse of seahorse populations, and we needed to take action. So the we, I just want to be clear, is Project Seahorse, which is the team that I co-founded and lead. Project Seahorse has a vision of a world in which marine ecosystems are healthy and well managed. We're very interdisciplinary and international, and we really are very proud of connecting research and management. Whatever we find out, we use for policy and management practices, and whatever is needed for policy and management dictates our research agenda. So although I'm a university professor, my love is frontline action, and that's where we work best and most effectively. So we work from community initiatives through to global United Nations conventions, and collaborating always with partners and communities. So seahorses are the focal animals that help us to pay attention, of course, to their well-being, but also to marine conservation writ large. So our team has a very strong conviction that the world is actually an onion. So if you take a cross-section of an onion, and you plop your favorite species at the center, and here I'm going to plop the seahorses right at the center of our scheme, you can think, oh, okay, we're going to save seahorses today. But I can guarantee you that for seahorses to do better, we're going to have to pay attention also to their habitats, their communities, and their ecosystems. So we do an awful lot of work, as I mentioned, on protected areas and other forms of habitat quality improvement. Those habitats, I hope I don't need to say, will only flourish, as will the species, if the people who are putting pressure on them make better decisions. So we work an awful lot with fishers and miners and dredgers and dumpers and shippers and anybody else whose work is, coastal developers, is affecting the animals and their locations, the species and spaces, if you will. But then if you're going to work with communities or work with the people who are the agents of change, you need to recognize they make decisions partly based on the well-being of their families. Are their kids in school? Do they have a roof over their heads? Do they have sufficient livelihood that they can reflect on their decisions rather than taking an all-out assault on natural resources? So we work a lot with various levels of government. We work on economic well-being and law and order and good governance. And that's at the provincial level, or here we're zooming out in southern India, but it would apply to anywhere in the world, whether it's at the local level or whether it's at the national level where the framework legislation is put in place. And then we also do an awful lot at the global level. And so, what happens at the UN level really matters. Globalization is a very real thing, and for good or for bad. So we do a lot in multilateral environmental agreements. And if you think about it, all these layers are exerting pressure that bears down on the seahorses in the center of our world. And if we're going to make a difference for the seahorses, we have to tackle everything that's applying pressure. So we work very much to achieve wins at all these layers. And of course, outside this is the human behavior of greed or altruism or self-indulgence or self-discipline. So if you take that view of the world as a bit of an onion, it forces you to be very holistic in your thinking, recognizing that studying seahorse sex isn't really going to sort it out, and that we've got to do far more than that, even as we continue to be interested in the animals themselves. So The solutions in marine conservation are going to be found very clearly by appreciating the interdependencies of marine life and human dependencies, human communities. So I'm going to just talk to you for a minute about some of the work we've done at the global scale, because it will take us through to this story about trawling I want to share. So the United Nations has a convention called CITES. CITES, which if you look at it, has a pretty cute logo. It actually is meant to be an elephant. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And these animals are being traded at huge levels. Probably about 25 million animals a year among about 80 countries is our lowest estimate. So really, really huge. And seahorses are never found in dense populations. They don't reproduce quickly and they form permanent pair bonds, and there's no way that these should be heavily exploited. So CITES actually deals with managing export trade in species that are placed on their appendices, on their lists of species of concern. It became pretty obvious that it might make sense to put the seahorses on their lists and let the countries that are members of CITES pay attention to them. There are currently 183 countries that are members of CITES, by the way, so it's a huge convention. So CITES has three ways of regulating exports. One is to ban them, the other is to limit them to sustainable levels, and a bit more besides, which I'll go into, and the third is actually just national support. At the time that we got involved, CITES was categorically refusing to deal with marine fishes. So it dealt with elephants and cactuses and parrots and orchids and no end of other taxa, but it would not deal with marine fishes. The feeling at the time was that marine fishes are far too economically important to be subject to the whims of a convention that had something of a conservation agenda. So we were enormously delighted that we actually got the first ever marine fish listings. So through our work, we were able to get the first global export regulations for any marine fishes, which was really quite momentous. And there's a long story behind there, but that's not today's story. So we got the first export regulations for marine fishes with the seahorses, and having achieved that, we were able to support colleagues and engage in other policy work to help bring about the listings of basking shark and whale shark and sawfish and white shark and various rays, manta rays and devil rays and hammerhead sharks and oceanic white-tip sharks and European eels and clarion angelfish from Mexico and so on. So now CITES, as a matter of course, takes on an awful lot of marine fish export regulation. And we're very pleased to tell you that, as a sideline, that for the live trade in seahorses for the aquariums, it has made a massive difference. It has really, really more or less ended the trade from the wild for aquariums. On the dried side, which is the dominant trade for seahorses, oddly, it has not been as effective, or maybe not oddly. So once CITES decides to regulate exports, at any point, countries can be asked to prove that they're meeting their obligations. And we got very involved in working with a couple of governments that were having enormous trouble meeting their obligations, and particularly Viet Nam and Thailand, but also Senegal and a host of other countries. So these countries ended up just deciding they didn't know what the heck to do, and they didn't have the political will to do it right, so they decided just to shut the trade down. And they just banned the exports of seahorses. And on the face of it, this sounds like fantastically good news. Put out the fireworks. But in all honesty, it made no difference whatsoever. Even though the export was officially banned, you can guess what happened. It all just went underground. So here we were doing all sorts of really special work with government agencies and international accords and management councils and all the rest. And the trade was really continuing. The trade in dried animals was really continuing more or less unmitigated. So what we realized, of course, is that bans are commonly hollow decisions that don't do much good. And the trade was persisting. So we had to think about, why is this trade persistent no matter what we do, seemingly correctly, with government agencies, customs, borders officials, and so on. And we realized that about 95% of the trade through Hong Kong, for example, was coming from countries that had closed down their exports. So basically the trade had gone underground and become hugely illegal. So it was pretty clear that we had to do something differently. So after much reflection and exploration of ideas, we realized that the key to the issue lies in this bottom trawling. So let's talk about bottom trawlers. So bottom trawlers go out and they scrape the bottom of the ocean. They level everything in their path. They collect everything in their path, and they drag it all up to the surface and land it, basically. Sometimes they throw it overboard, where it's mostly dead and decaying, but usually it's taken nowadays to land where it's processed, and more on that in a minute. So bottom trawlers are the least selective fishing method you can imagine, and the most destructive fishing method, really, that you can imagine. And it goes on with impunity. I mean, try to imagine us allowing bulldozing and scraping and scouring and lifting everything in their path on our North Shore mountains. How much would we be screaming within minutes if that were happening? But it's happening in our oceans all the time. We don't even discuss it. In fact, most people have never even heard about it. But this is what bottom trawling looks like. This is the plumes as it goes through, and there are about 100,000 bottom trawlers working at any given time around the world. Let me just pause on that number, 100,000 bottom trawlers that are working around the world. This is actually in the northern Adriatic Sea in Italy, and you can see the furrows left even by previous trawls. So most areas are trawling over trawled habitat. They've been trawling decades, and guess what? If you do research now, you'll find that this trawl pass doesn't do much damage because we've already trawled the heck out of the place for 50, 60 years. This is what a bottom trawl looks like close up. It has these heavy metal doors, they're called, the big metal plates you see to hold the net open, and a weighted chain to keep it on the bottom. And you can imagine the level of destruction. These nets, just pause for a minute, these nets are up to 45 stories wide. So picture a 45-story building, tip it on its side, and drag it through the water. That's the sort of width of the trawl gear that we're dealing with. And they tow for about 5 hours often, covering maybe 30 to 40 kilometers during that period for each tow. So the damage is tremendous. It's not a small enterprise. I mean, it's really, really massive. About a quarter of the world's marine catches come through bottom trawling. About 50% of the fish that's by biomass, by weight, that's landed in Asia comes through bottom trawling. In many areas of the world, 80% of the seabed is bottom trawled, often repeatedly. And yet, we're not talking about it. You hear about forest clear cutting, but you don't hear any cocktail party. Well, who has cocktail parties these days? You don't hear any Zoom discussions about the situation of bottom trawling. And so how do I explain the scale of this in a more tangible way? Well, let's go back to our seahorses. So I mentioned that bottom trawlers commonly only catch 1 to 2 seahorses per vessel per night. So it sounds like nothing. But if I tell you that the first 21 countries we surveyed were exporting 11 million seahorses annually just from bottom trawl. Think about how much trawl effort that represents at 1 or 2 per trawl per night. I'm going to call it the Seahorse Index of trawl pressure, I think. And our current estimate is that just 5 non-selective fisheries in 21 countries are landing 76 million individual seahorses every year. So 1 or 2 at a time. So the scale is extraordinary. And of course, we're now doing research to talk about just how many species are in the bottom of these nets, and more on that in a minute. So an awful lot is caught in bottom trawls. In fact, anything in the path is caught in bottom trawls. There's really not any selectivity. So we're laying down the basic knowledge right now of how many species are caught in bottom trawls. Believe it or not, nobody has looked at that. So for fish species, our tally is approaching 3,000 species that are caught in bottom trawls around the world. And they often end up looking like this. So this is fish feed for aquaculture. Everything is just blobbed together in undifferentiated masses and sold to aquaculture in the form of fish meal or fish oil or chicken feed or any other animal feed. So this is how much of our ocean marine life that everybody this Roman on Zoom values so much. This is how a lot of it ends up because of these bottom trawlers. It's quite extraordinary. It's prevalent in most countries. This is a picture of the New Zealand deep sea trawler, which is working in international waters in the Tasman Sea. And almost all countries have a bad track record of managing bottom trawl fishing. What we find in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries that pride themselves on strong fisheries management is deeply worrying. So even, New Zealand banned bottom trawling from one area, and 15 years later, there's still no recovery. So it's really a mess in just about just about everywhere. And there are huge layers of concern. So let me bring up the ecological concern first. They catch everything in their path. And they mow down the seagrasses and the sponges and the corals and the other habitats. So they change the ecosystem. And then what's really becoming obvious is they're disturbing the sediment and disrupting carbon sequestration. So the evidence is clear that we're adding to our climate change woes by this bottom trawling as it damages the carbon sequestration. So, marine sediments may well be the largest pool of carbon storage in the world, and we're hauling it up with this bottom trawling and releasing the carbon. So that's a big concern as well. But, it's not just ecological. And so I also want to just mention some of the economic concerns. We're removing tons of food species as bycatch. So a lot of the stuff that you and I would like to eat when it's a bit bigger is caught either incidentally here or as juveniles. When it can't be used, it's just, again, processed in undifferentiated mass. The catch in places like China or India or Viet Nam is sold at about 10 cents US per kilo, up to maybe 50 cents US per kilo. So you can guess that most bottom trawlers do not earn money. In fact, they lose money. They lose a lot of money. And they only keep going because of the subsidies, commonly fuel subsidies. So the governments, our governments, are paying bottom trawlers to keep fishing. And those subsidies are really, really significant. And currently the World Trade Organization is trying to come up with, they've made the first steps, but there's constant ongoing exchanges about how best to process an elimination of fishing subsidies so that, if we did that, a lot of the most destructive fisheries would have to close down because they're not viable. There are a lot of social concerns. So some of them are that these non-selective fisheries obviously damage selective fisheries, small scale inshore, hook and line, net, trap, small net fisheries. So that really sets a competition between the bottom trawls and often some of the poorest people in the country. So a lot of conflict with artisanal and small scale fishers. And sometimes a lot of the bottom trawlers, particularly in Thailand, rely on forced labor, in fact, slavery, errant slavery. And there's been some great investigations by Martha Mendoza and other Pulitzer Prize winning journalists about the level of slavery on Thai bottom trawlers, commonly migrants from places like Cambodia or Myanmar. So a lot of trafficking, a lot of labor violations. Essentially, whether you look at it from an ecological, and economic, or a social side, bottom trawling sucks. There are other considerations. So it's becoming really clear that bottom trawling is one of the major threats to our marine archaeology. Nowadays, the plan is to leave wrecks in place, but those are getting plowed down by the bottom trawls as well. And then I'm in the midst of just learning about the tremendous damage caused to submarine cables. So this is a map of some of the major cables, telecom cables around the world. We've just this week overlaid the map of trawling on the map of cables, and there's not a single cable that isn't in areas that are being bottom trawled. And there are really significant snags of those trawls, of those cables by bottom trawls. So faults off Ireland caused by bottom trawling cost up to 1.4 million euros each to repair after bottom trawl. So there's so many reasons to stop this egregious practice. The story unfortunately gets worse because we're now sliding into what we're calling annihilation fishing. So we've done quite a bit of work in southern India where maybe 30,000 trawlers operate, with 5,500 in the state of Tamil Nadu alone. And they've just proliferated over the last 50 years. So they violate all of the limits on boat size and engine power and all the rest with impunity. Nobody seems to do much about it. And they go out and they have no target. Like, I want you to imagine for a moment a fishery with no target. They just go out seeking life, carbon, everything that we care about. All species are subject to the same devastating attack with no management protocols, really, because you can't exactly set size limits or catch quotas when you don't even know what you're going out for. So it's all brought back in an undifferentiated mass and is, as I say, sold for chicken feed or animal feed, or sometimes into a horrible white compressed stuff called surimi. So our work in there has been a bit startling, to say the least. So India actually banned the catch and trade of seahorses. So we went in to try to figure out how that was playing out, and of course found that as long as this bottom trawling continued, there was no real attempt to limit the catch and trade of seahorses. So seahorses are still caught in large numbers because the risks are really low, there's not much enforcement. And one of the weirdest problems globally is that in many, many countries, the conservation expertise lies in the Forestry Bureau or in an agricultural agency, and fisheries and coastal marine agencies are focused almost entirely on exploitation and production. So it can be really hard to get good enforcement of any conservation measures in the ocean. So this is the sort of scene in Tuticorin now. This is the catch landed from bottom trawlers. I wandered around filming this for a while. And this stuff, as I say, this is just life dumped on the ground, and this goes off to be chicken feed. So, we're obliterating marine wildlife, we're destroying habitats, we're worsening climate change, we're undermining food security, we're losing money and on subsidies, and it harms people. I mean, the litany goes on forever. So that's all very well and good. It also undermines all of our global accords. So the United Nations has a suite of sustainable development goals directed by 2030 for many of them. And one of them is life below the water. It's number 14. And 14 is, being systematically, any efforts are being negated by this ongoing bottom trawling. Likewise, we're in the middle right now of negotiating a global biodiversity framework, the next wave of work on that post 2020. And a lot of the initiatives within that will be basically negated by bottom trawling. So it's really time that we got serious about ending this practice in some sort of systematic, thoughtful way. So, that's all very well, and I've told you a tale of woe, but what the heck happens if we end bottom trawling? Can things get better? So I mentioned the study in New Zealand where it didn't get much better. That was quite deep on seamounts. But let's look at an example in Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, after there was a ban on bottom trawling, the whole special administrative region has banned bottom trawling now, largely because of work done at UBC, I'm happy to say, not by us. And after they banned bottom trawling, the changes were really encouraging. So the bottom trawling was banned in 2012, and the surveys were done for the subsequent 3 years. And they found that they had higher sedimentary organic contents, they had more abundance of species, more richness of species, more diversity of species. Just everything began to come back pretty steadily when you stopped bottom trawling. So it isn't terminal if we can just get rid of this egregious practice and in many ways just leave nature alone for a bit. Now, the ocean has a lot of connectivity. We can get influx of species to rehabilitate these areas. Another example comes from Lyme Bay in the UK. Lyme Bay, this is the number of taxa on the y-axis, the up and down axis, against time, or the functional richness, so the diversity, if you like, again against time. The blue bar indicates inside the new marine protected area, and the dotted gray black bar is outside the marine protected area. And what you see is that we're getting, as soon as we end trawling and dredging, we're getting an increase in the number of species and their richness, their diversity. So areas that have been trawled very, very seriously have the potential to recover. And that, I think, is incredibly exciting, that we just pull these fishing practices out of these areas and in many ways just leave nature alone and see what happens. So what we're aiming for is this sort of healthier ecosystem. It's really, really important to get these trawls out and let the ecosystems recover. The question is, if you close down bottom trawl fishing, what is the threat to people? Because we can't just blunder around completely preoccupied by marine life. We also have to care pretty deeply about the people who apply pressure to it, if only to ensure that the management measures persist and are supported. So we're really now getting into cost-benefit analyses, trying to figure out what the costs of bottom trawling are to people and what the benefits of bottom trawling are to people. And how this bottom trawling is punishing fishers who use more selective inshore gear, more careful gear. So that's one of our big efforts of work right now. We're trying to figure out, why do people get into bottom trawling? Why do they stay in bottom trawling? And what would lead them to stop bottom trawling? And it's interesting because it seems from our current work, we're wrapping up one phase of it, that many of the people involved in bottom trawling have no affinity to the ocean, no coastal relationships, and no history of fishing. The bottom trawl labor basically comes from the cities or from the hills, and therefore, of course it matters, but it's now no different as an economic problem from where you involve people in road building or making widgets in a factory. You know, you've got the same challenge of what do we do with people such that they can still earn a meaningful livelihood, but it's not sacrosanct, it's not distinctively different, the trawl issue, from road building or factory work. So we're really investigating the relationship between people and fishing as to how we might be able to generate transitions of people away from bottom trawl fisheries. I've got quite a few students working in India on this issue, Indian students, graduate students working in India on these issues. So, you know, there's no doubt that banning bottom trawling is going to be, you know, a pretty long and winding road. Our plan is definitely to do this. We're not afraid of data poor situations, and we're really used to plunging into research and action feedback loops. So we're currently amassing the evidence to support the end of bottom trawling, looking at gap analysis of the studies that have been done before, looking at trawl closures and what you can gain by getting rid of the trawling, and looking at the costs and benefits on a socioeconomic level. And everything that we learn, of course, goes straight into the management and policy feedback loops. And the blue economy might be one way in. There's a big push to really look at how we can sustainably use all the ocean resources, hopefully with the word sustainably underlined there. So there are some pretty clear ways forward for this, and we're really excited about them. So one of them is to implement existing rules and regulations. Another is to ban bottom trawling in all so-called marine protected areas. So a huge proportion of the world's protected areas allow bottom trawling. Wrap your head around that one for a minute. And there's now a very significant global initiative to get 30% of the ocean in each country protected by 2030. And we're working hard to see how we might actually exclude bottom trawling as part of generating that 30% protection. And also we need to reject the expansion of bottom trawling. So this is work that we're doing partly as lead members of a global consortium of about 60 organizations that have come together to create a group called Transform Bottom Trawling, transformbottomtrawling.org. You know, there's clear ways forward, and one of the easiest is to convince people that trawling in protected areas is downright dumb. It's just inexcusable. Although I had an interesting exchange about that this week with fisheries, you can ask me about it. So we're able now to think of actually eliminating bottom trawling, partly because we have such fantastic technical capacity now. So this map is from showing you where the trawlers are operating, and using global fishing watch, we can actually look at individual vessels, we can see transshipment, we can tell by the way they move, what sort of gear they're likely using. So there's ways of actually insisting, for example, that the trawlers get out of protected areas. It can be monitored quite remotely now. If you want to amuse yourselves, go onto Global Fishing Watch, and you too can track fishing vessels around the world. So, you know, it's really the big initiatives are making certain that we end the harmful subsidies and ending slavery, indentured labor, and coercion, which again is kind of pushing at an open door. Pretty much every country has said that it doesn't want to tolerate slavery. So the evidence that slavery is active in not just the fishing, but also the processing of the catch should really get people's attention, and encouraging government to meet its international promises. So we've got years of working at global levels, working effectively, creating change, gathering momentum, and now we're just redirecting our efforts a little bit differently, now on bottom trawling rather than limiting export of trade or limiting export trade of marine fishes. So the good news is there's lots of hope, but our biggest single challenge is that most people don't even know what bottom trawling is. So the more we can talk it up, the more we can engage our colleagues and our friends and our collaborators and make sure we write about it and talk about it and push the knowledge that this stuff is crazy as a way of extracting resources from the ocean, and the farther we're going to be. And I'm always asked, what are the individual initiatives we can take, the personal action? The first is do talk about it, like really talk about bottom trawling. The second is when you go to buy seafood, it's obviously important to ask whether it was caught by a bottom trawl. And I ask all the time, and usually I get a very confused look from the serving staff or from the supermarket staff. But if I ask often enough, eventually they go and find out. And then they come back and tell me, oh, it's from a sustainably caught shrimp fishery. And I go, no, there's no such thing, basically, except for our spot prawns. So please go talk to your chef again. But people are starting to pay attention because we're asking those questions. So keep asking. The third thing, of course, is using your vote. We really need to insist on ocean policy in every level of government. And then, really insisting the government and industry address bottom trawling in a meaningful way. So every one of you is a pretty important ally on this quest to try to reduce the extraordinary pressure that is being exerted on our ocean by this damnable fishing method that is so prevalent and so egregiously dangerous. And with that, let's talk about anything that interests you.